Hello, everybody. My name is Ryan Donovan. I'm the director of the Southborough Library. Thank you for coming to tonight's program. We're very happy to have Sebastian Ebarb in our first ever Cultural Voices series program. So no one came to hear me talk, so I'm going to turn it over to Sebastian, and I'll be back on a little bit later in the program to answer any questions you guys might have. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. So my full name is Sebastian Ellington, Flying Eagle Ebarb. I am a member of the Choctaw-Apache Tribe of Ebarb, but we will get into that in a little bit. Before we really get into anything else, I want to do a land acknowledgement for a good chunk of Massachusetts, which is formerly Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc land, along with many, many, many other tribes. If you are, for some reason, calling from outside of Massachusetts or from a little bit more west in Massachusetts, you can go to the URL at the bottom here and take a look at who originally resided on your land. There's a really interesting map that you can kind of take a look at. There's a little bit of a slider so you can see how things have changed over time. Obviously, the land that's shown here is, obviously time periods and things change. So it's as precise as could be, given the information at hand. And we always try to be as precise as we can be, but realities are realities, and history is the way that history is. So I just want to take just a little moment and time and just say that everything that's said here are my own thoughts and opinions. Within Indian country, there are infinite views, and I do mean that. And this is just one of mine and my perception of a variety of different things. So, come along on the journey with me as I talk about my personal feelings, connection, and understanding of a variety of different topics. So a little bit about me. I am formerly the design director for the city of Boston, and now I am a professor at Northeastern of design. Specifically a teaching professor of design at Northeastern, where I started there in January, and I like it quite a bit. And so, I have been lecturing about this topic for probably the last 2 years or so. And this is some of my art that you can see around some of the justice issues and things that exist or like thrive within our various different Native communities. And so I have a large body of work that I continue to work on. The stickers on the the left-hand side being most recent, and other products and things that you can see that are available here. You can always check me out on Instagram if that's something of interest to you. So a little bit about my tribe and what we're about. So we are located in Western Sabine Parish, which is the red piece that's highlighted over here. It is a combination of multiple settlers and tribal members from various different places who have come together to form a community. One of the interesting things about Louisiana was because a big chunk of it was picked up in Louisiana Purchase, and then other chunks of it were picked up over other periods of time. It has a very interesting and odd relationship with the Native American community there, which obviously, as a boundary of a state is something that is made up by white settlers, but created some very interesting dynamics. We're not going to be going too much into that, but the tribe is actually made up of multiple histories and multiple lineages, as you can see here in the talk. So it includes the Adai, the Lipan Apaches, multiple bands of Choctaw, and many, many, many Mission Indians from a variety of different areas. Obviously also mixed with both French and Spanish folks who lived in the area, creating something of a very unique and interesting place to live. I myself grew up in Brooklyn, New York, far, far way away from here, but I'm very connected with my tribe. I am currently the webmaster. I serve technically on the powwow committee. Oops, excuse me. I serve on the powwow committee. I also serve on the federal recognition committee. One of the things that you'll notice is that we are not a federally recognized tribe, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that means for folks, and the variety of different ways that you can be recognized by gods, because it is important to understanding like how things work within Indian country. So where I want to really start kicking off our conversation, or rather my lecture, is a little bit more about how we define Native American. So we is an interesting word here. So how natives define themselves are very different than necessarily settlers in the settler state that now occupies what is now known as the United States or the Americas, decides who a Native American is. So on the left-hand side, you can see this is pulled from dictionary.com, just so that we can have the conversation. But a member of an indigenous peoples of North or Central or South America, especially those indigenous now in the continental United States, so relating to Native Americans. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who oversees federally recognized tribes, only defines Indians or Native Americans as people who are federally recognized within the United States. There's hundreds of federally recognized tribes from Alaska to Hawaii and everywhere in between. This is an important distinction, that we have like the generalized understanding or the social understanding kind of outlined in the dictionary. And then there's the official federal government understanding, which is who we deem to be Native American is Native American. Now, the reason for this is something that we're going to jump into in just a few slides, but a lot of it comes down to money, financing, and a whole lot of history. So when we start thinking about the broader Native American community, how do they think of themselves? So often folks will say, do you have a community that claims you back? Are you contributing to the culture in some significant or meaningful way, or perhaps a small way? Do you have a shared cultural identity and lineage, and/or are you a descendant of freemen? So just a clarification point on that last one. There are many members of Native American tribes who are delineated from slaves of those tribes before the Civil War, and potentially after, depending on what state that they were in. One of the things that especially the Cherokee did and the United States government did was say, hey, we need to make up for these injustices that have been created. And so freemen are on a particular list and roll throughout multiple tribes, not all, but multiple tribes. And they are considered tribal members, even if they do not have Native American lineage, then they are considered Native American. So this is a broad understanding of how many, especially from a social standpoint, view the culture of being Native American. Can you claim a community that claims you back? Are you contributing to the culture? Do you share the culture, identity, and lineage? So oftentimes this is a sticking point for a lot of folks for a number of reasons. When I say community, I mean tribe or community. When we think of Native Americans, we think of a broad swath of people that used to live here, but the reality is we are still very much here. And I would continue to argue that when we use the term Native American, it is a useful term to talk about the series of groups and tribes that lived here. But the reality is that's somewhat whitewashing history. The reality is that there's hundreds of different tribes, cultures, all of them having their own or connected languages, rituals, religions, etc. And it's easy to define Native Americans in a broad category, especially from power building and for census taking or whatever it may be, as an easy demographic to record. But the reality is, I, as a Native American, and I call myself a Native, say I can't actually speak for anybody but my own tribe. And even that, I would not say that I speak for my own tribe. I speak for myself, because the tribal council who makes decisions for the tribe are the ones who actually speak for the tribe. So obviously this can be a complex history that people don't fully grasp, that on some level there is no such thing as a Native American. What you have is a series of hundreds and hundreds of different unique cultures that existed in the same place at the same time for thousands and thousands of years. And then came along settlers. So one of the things that I often get asked the most about is that people say like, well, I have an ancestor who is a Cherokee princess, or I have, I did a 23andMe and I have Native DNA. So many people in almost any tribe and who fall under the term Native will probably say to you that does not make you Native American. And so that's for a number of different reasons. DNA has been used as a tool and weaponized against Natives for a very, very long time. Much in the way the brown paper bag test or the one drop rule, it was used for Black folks. How much DNA or how much Native you are would equate to whether or not you gained or were allowed tribal status and whether or not you were recognized by the federal government. One of the reasons that the federal government wanted to put these and continues to want to put these limitations on is because if they have a formal treaty and recognize Native Americans, and they also have to, or any particular person, they have to recognize the injustice, or they have to live up to the treaties that they've signed with those various different tribes and or groups. And I have to tell you, the United States government has never lived up to those treaties. In fact, there's millions, if not billions of dollars that are owed to various different tribes. And there have been several influential court cases around this that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, but we're not going to dive into that just now. So if you jump on and say, hey, I have a DNA test and it says that I am Native American, it doesn't mean that you are Native American. What it means is that you then have the right to research your lineage, just like anybody else. And then when you find a connection, and preferably a connection with a community that's willing to claim you back, and sometimes not so much, you then have the ability to investigate and begin to ask questions and involve yourself in a community that could claim you. So essentially it is a gateway, a doorway for you to what we often refer to in Indian country, reconnect. There are many, many people who are reconnecting. There are people who grew up on reservations who feel like they're constantly reconnecting. There are people who grow up in cities or live in cities who feel like they're reconnecting. There are lots of different people on the spectrum that is reconnecting, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of people, but it gives you that space and time to be able to make those connections. Not to say that if you are somebody who appreciates Native culture that you can't contribute to it, or rather, I shouldn't say contribute, but rather enjoy respectfully and connect with it, absolutely. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit. So I've used a lot of different words interchangeably here. So we say Native, we say Indigenous, and I just want to talk a little bit about what those things mean. So Native meaning that they often, again, are relating to the earliest inhabitants in what is now known as America. I say that because many, and I put American in quotes, because many Natives do not consider themselves Americans. Yes, officially they are citizens, but many people do not recognize the federal government of the United States because they feel like many people, most people are still settlers in lands that do not belong to them. Indigenous is a larger word that often brings in people of similar descent, but across the globe. So Aborigines folks, anybody who is indigenous to or the earliest inhabitant of any known particular land, they are considered indigenous. So you can be native and indigenous, but you can't, if you live in, say, it's not necessarily considered native if you live in a country where native is not a term that is used. Mostly native is used to describe Americans or people in Canada, the United States, what is now known as the United States, and what is now known as Mexico. All right, so let's jump in and talk a little bit about the complex history of federal, state, and unrecognized recognition. So the federal government recognizes 574 different tribes. The thing to note about this is most of those tribes are tribes that either have treaties or direct dealing with the federal government at any particular time. This is where certain states like Louisiana and other places kind of toss up a giant question mark, because although there were natives living there for tens of thousands of years, there were not formal recognition lines or treaties between the federal government and some of the folks, many of the folks who were living there. Currently, there's 36, I believe, states recognized tribes in about 11 states. And there are some states that don't have a formal recognition process, but have like a more broad sense of like, we recognize that this group is Native American, this group isn't. For those who did not have a formal relationship with the federal government, state recognition is normally the first step in getting federal recognition. So why do people want federal recognition? Federal recognition often comes with more, and I want to say benefits in a very like loose term here, but it allows for better connection, it allows for more resources, and it allows for a greater sense of self-determination within the tribe. It often means that you can buy and put land into trust for the whole community, which is possible in some states, but not all states. Lastly, there's unrecognized. There are many different people here in the United States who are Native, but who are not recognized by either state or federal standards. That's because both state and federal standards are an extremely high burden to prove. Because again, they want to keep resources, in my opinion, away from natives because it costs them trillions, hundreds, trillions, whatever it is of dollars. If you had to provide running water to what some people would consider a middle of nowhere res, why would you want to pay all that money in infrastructure when you could put that to somebody else? There are lots of people who are unrecognized and still native. Again, the barriers for entry are completely outrageous. And it's all determined by people who want to gatekeep. At the end of the day, it's really about multiple communities recognizing other communities. And regardless of what federal or state say, natives know who they are and what they are about. But those statuses often create easier opportunities from both a social and fiscal standpoint and are necessary for survival in the current state. So, and this goes to prove the point. This is a really wonderful Instagram channel that you can go and pop on and take a look at. They often post statistics and information about Native groups and people, and they also provide very, very good in-depth informational pieces. And so this is just to say and reiterate the point that regardless of federal or state recognition, we don't require that for our sovereignty. But the realities of the capitalist system and the government system that we currently live under, not by choice, we often need them as a tool in order, again, to survive. So, America, Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean. Again, I put these all in quotes because not every single group necessarily recognizes the validity of these countries and where they come from. Again, I want to just refocus on this map. There are hundreds and hundreds of tribes that exist on the lands that are now called these things. However, we as a people, and I mean that in the broader sense of Native or Indigenous peoples, have survived, maintained our culture, and continue to thrive. All right, so Indian versus Native. Let's talk about this a little bit. So often I get the question, if you say Indian country, then can I say Indian? And what does that mean? So Indian is a term that was created because folks believed that they had reached the Indies or India when sailing across the ocean. Unfortunately, they were completely incorrect and named the place wrong. And there's a long history, there are entire books written about the naming culture and acumen behind this. And so we're not going to dive too deep into it. Most folks refer to themselves as Native, and not Native American, but Native, occasionally Native American. In Canada, they'll often refer to themselves as First Nation, and there are a myriad of other names. Indian is often used, and there are many Native Americans or natives who refer to themselves as Indians. They say, hey, I grew up with this name, that's what I grew up with, and that's what I am, that's how I feel. But especially in younger social movements, the concept of Native and or Indigenous is much more prominent. The other thing about the word Indian that's really important is you'll notice that many centers and places, especially in the Northeast, are named Indian. And that's because a lot of the treaties that were originally signed either with the British or the Dutch or whomever it may be, use the word Indian. And so it's important to maintain that relationship because if you have a treaty and you're using that as proof, you don't necessarily want to call yourself something different, even if you don't necessarily feel yourself to be Indian. So it's a complex word. If an organization, if a person refers to themselves as Indian, then you're more than welcome to do it. But if I were you, I would stick with native or indigenous person and understanding the context behind those words. So let's talk a little bit very briefly about some modern native movements. Some of the folks on the call will probably remember some of these. So the occupation of Alcatraz started November 20th, 1969. A group of native folks took over the island. I believe it was 87 Native Americans took it over as a protest and lived on the island for quite some time. A lot of this was spurred by AIM, the American Indian Movement, which you see here. It was a large organization that was mostly focused on native urban issues. There was a policy quite some time ago that in, I believe, the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, that asked the federal government would give a one-way bus ticket to folks who lived on reservations to move them to cities in an attempt to drown out, well, a lot of different things, but get people to move off the res so that the reservations would collapse and they could then therefore take over that land or potentially not owe or deal with treaty issues that they were currently facing. So AIM developed itself as a way to deal with the systemic problems that were happening inside urban areas. The I Don't Know More movement is much more recent. It started in 2012, and it's mostly aimed around Canada and some of the horrible things that the then Prime Minister Stephen Harper and the Conservative federal government were doing at the time, including arresting people, not allowing them to get the various different access to tools, money, etc. that they needed. It's a large organization that still technically works, is functioning to this day. It's definitely one that's worth looking up. But currently, the two main movements that are happening right now is the land back movement. Land back means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but at very minimum, it means that Native peoples want their land back. Often white folks believe that land back means that you have to give your land back. And yes, certainly give your land back. But it's not just about ownership of land. It's about the political and economic controls, but it is also about who gets say in what happens on that land. Harmful chemicals are constantly spilled into our earth, into our oceans, all over the place. How we treat lawns are food deserts for bees, if you've ever heard that before. We are constantly in a state of destroying the land around us, and natives want to return to a time where we gave back to the land and lived in more symbiotic relationship. And so the more land that we control, the better off folks are. One of the big things that's been happening lately, if you haven't been paying attention to the news, is wildfires in the western part of the United States. For centuries, natives out in various different tribes out there have been saying, like, we have all this knowledge of how to fight these fires. For centuries, or thousands of years, they did control burns in order to remove dead brush and to recultivate the land with ash. And now all of a sudden, even though they've been advocating this for years and years and years and years with indigenous knowledge, now all of a sudden the state government of California and many of these other states is like, hey, you know what we should do? We should start essentially the same exact program that indigenous folks have been advocating for years. And this is what land back is about. It is about recultivating the land and also controlling the economic and political power that exists in the current system the capitalist system that we live in. And of course, there are many people who want actual full physical return of all land. In fact, many of you may be familiar with Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore, all of the United States is viewed as stolen land, but Mount Rushmore is in fact extremely stolen land. People were forcibly removed from what is now known as Mount Rushmore. A pot of money was put to the side for the tribe that controlled it at the time, which has still to this day sits in a bank and has not been touched. They are sacred mountains. And so what the United States decided to do was blow a bunch of presidents' faces into the side of it because they thought that was a great idea. Every year there are protests normally for 4th of July at the monument in order to remind people that this is unceded land that was taken without provocation and disastrously so. So land back also has grown into wanting everything back, as I kind of alluded to before. This is a Thrive United t-shirt that you can probably see pretty frequently on Native American Instagram or Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. The idea being that it's not just, the land is the basis for much of our many different tribes' cultures. And so by taking land back, we take back water, we take back medicine, we take back bundles, we take back ceremony, cosmology, family, values, language, and community. All of these things are intertwined in many different tribal communities. And land back is not just about, again, it's about, often folks will say land back is often about acknowledging who the original inhabitants of the land are. And that is true, like land acknowledgements are great, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but if you're not willing to give and cede control back, don't do a land acknowledgement, because you're not in it to actually do the work. For a really long time, a lot of Native folks were content with land acknowledgement, but we are no longer content with it. And that's where the movement has come from and gained strength and moved forward. So the second movement that I want to talk about is the missing women, missing murdered Indigenous women and girls and two spirits. For those who don't know, two spirit is a Native American term, which is an all-encompassing term, which means a lot of different things. But essentially, at the end of the day, the colonial system that we currently live under the current gender binary understanding of sexuality and or who people love is confining and often erases Native American history and certainly tribal identities. And so the two spirit kind of label is applied to folks who fit within those certain bounds. So the missing murder, Indigenous women and girls and two spirits movement is centered around the idea that we have thousands and thousands of missing women. As you can see from the sign, just in 2016, 5,712 Native women were reported murdered or missing. So this comes from a lot of different places, and it is tied to the land back movement in a number of different ways. So many of the missing women, because where reservations sit, often there is a complication in terms of who is in control of the land, who investigates murder, and who is supposed to be in charge of finding missing people. Often locals, white locals, will go on reservation land and kidnap Native women specifically for to sell their bodies on the slavery market and or to rape them. Excuse me, but truth is truth. This is extremely prevalent in Hawaii, where the tourist trade is actually fueling a lot of the sex industry and or missing women who are in fact missing. The other piece of this and how it's tied to land back in many ways is that often when people are building pipelines or when companies build pipelines, they create what are known as man camps. Man camps are essentially the camps of the workers who are building the pipeline. These pipelines or these camps often move with the pipeline and change constantly. Essentially, as soon as one of these man camps show up, women begin to go missing. Now, we can talk all day long about the problematic nature of masculinity in our society, but the reality is this is what is actually happening on the ground. And so the goal of this movement is to obviously protect women, missing women, find missing women, avenge is maybe not the incorrect word, but find out what happened to murdered women, girls, and two-spirit folks, and get land and have sovereignty over our land so we can say no more to these pipelines, which then bring man camps, which then bring the murder and the abduction of our women. So I would encourage you to take a look at the Native Justice link below. I'm not doing a full justice to any of these movements. We only have but so much time. So I want to make sure that we're kind of going through this stuff. So overall, most of what white American society thinks of as Native American is incorrect. Most folks have asked me, or many folks have asked me, not most folks, many folks have asked me, do I still live in a teepee? Do I live on a res? Most Native Americans do not live on reservations. Most Native Americans did not live in teepees. There are many different types of house forms. There are many different types of cultures. All of these things are perpetrated by a culture that have created a problematic stereotype around what it is to be Native. This photo of Edward Curtis, you can see here, is actually a really great example. Edward Curtis has been celebrated time and time again for his beautiful, honestly, beautiful photos of natives. He was paid a lot of money to go and capture what was left of natives as, you know, white culture expanded east, from the east to the west, in what was known or viewed as a dying series of cultures or singular culture. The problem is with Edward Curtis, or many problems, is that he often would whitewash history. He wouldn't record information. So he would often just kind of put question marks and not follow up to figure out who he was photographing. Many of his photographs were posed and staged. And so he might have somebody who was Osage and have, you know, a completely different regalia or thing that they would be having on. He would go out and buy, you know, what he viewed as costume or regalia, as many natives refer to it. And he would just put any native he saw in it and would pose them, giving a really unrealistic and not necessarily correct history of what it is to be Native. I continue, you know, this is a set that's actually up for sale right now. I took this photo earlier today from a website. One of the interesting things is there's probably 6 or 7 Native cultures stereotypically represented here, and all of it is wrong. So this is called a cowboy Wild West playset, except for the fact that many of the items here are incorrect. You'll notice the totem pole in the way back, which is a Northwest Coast idol, which you often would see, again, in that area, mixed with a teepee, which is known as a plains form of housing. You also see folks holding different bows, different arrows from different places all over what is now known as the United States, headdresses from a variety of different communities, none of it making sense or paying any attention or to actual, like what was actually happening. All of this is kind of clearly made by a random toy company who doesn't care. They just want to sell these items. So through that understanding, pardon me, we then create these larger kind of markers of how white people view Native Americans. And so all of these images are pulled from Illuminative, which is a Native American organizing organization, where they're really there to build Native power across what is now known as the United States. And so, you know, from people grow up with toys like we saw before, or these pictures of Edward Curtis, and then they also grow up with these really racist team names. And so there has been a large push recently, well, really for decades now, to change and ban these racist names. One of the things that's very clear is that names like this contribute to low self-esteem within Native children, harm Native communities, and are completely unnecessary. You'll notice that a lot of the fandom and things like this will dress up in what is often referred to as red face, which is tantamount to dressing up in blackface. They'll dress up in stereotypical costumes, things that are honestly just racist. Often you'll see, especially for what is formerly known as, or currently known as the Braves, which is what you see the racist brand one in the middle. They'll do what they refer to as the tomahawk chop. They'll often use words like scalp them and things of that nature. And just for clarification, scalping never existed until white people showed up. White people are the ones who requested scalps as a way to prove that somebody had been killed. And mostly Native Americans. More Native Americans were scalped than any other race. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening currently in the state of Massachusetts. So right now, the state of Massachusetts is re-examining its seal. The seal in itself has extremely racist origins, and we're going to dive into that in just a little bit. And you can see one of the original versions over here on the right-hand side. You'll notice that the Indian here, and that's the term that they use, is actually saying the words, come over here and help us. In a nod to the idea that white people are here to help and save natives. The town of Natick, which you see here, has a seal that is extremely racist, and they're currently in the process of updating it. So you'll see here what is a stereotypical program, even though this clothing is actually historically inaccurate, teaching natives the Bible. So the reason, and you'll notice the book behind the seal, which is part of the larger crest, is a book, and this book is actually the Bible. The idea being that the Massachusetts actually had their first, when pilgrims came over, when settlers came over, they printed Bibles in the new language for the Massachusetts, which actually in some ways saved their language. Maybe not the right exact language that I would probably should use, but that recorded their language, but at the same time forced them into conversion of Christianity. And so this seal, an image depicts pilgrims forcibly educating natives into their religion. So this is just an example of what's currently happening at the state and what some of the issues are with the current seal. So the bow is inaccurate to both the time and place. The belt that's being worn is inaccurate. The face is a different tribe and from a Chippewa chief, supposedly from Montana, who is referred to as a fine specimen of an Indian. Portions of the body were taken from a Native American skeleton that were dug up in Winthrop. The downward pointed arrow indicates a pacified Native American. And then probably worst of all, the Latin motto says, by the sword we seek peace. Now, on face value, if you didn't know anything else about it, it sounds pretty badass to say something like that. But essentially what it means is we're gonna come here and conquer the natives who live here by force. So luckily there is currently a commission that is looking into solving some of these problems. And I'm now realizing that I'm going a little bit over time. So we're gonna jump into this video to talk a little bit about, so a lot of what you're seeing there is racism, appropriation. So how do we talk a little bit more about appreciation? Can you guys hear this? I will assume no or yes.
No, Sebastian,
Okay.
we can't hear it.
Okay, give me just one moment and I will take my headphones out. One moment, please. Just gotta shut up. All right. So let's start this from the beginning. There we go.
Gorgeous kimono. A kimono, what? Let's talk cultural appropriation. Genuinely learning and connecting with other cultures toward a mutual benefit, that's appreciation.
Appropriation is taking an aspect of another culture for personal gain while erasing the origins and meaning. To avoid this,
Take responsibility and be honest, especially when you're wrong or uninformed. It's the only way to learn and grow.
check your motivations. Do you really need to wear the thing? Do you really need to participate? Don't use other cultures to satisfy needs of belonging, desirability, or uniqueness.
Is it accurate? Cultural appropriation erases nuance, depth, and complexity, all while claiming to make it better. That's what colonizers do. Yikes.
Determine who's profiting. Profits shouldn't go to companies or people with no roots in the culture of origin. Buy directly from communities. But remember, just because something's on sale doesn't mean it's appropriate for you.
Is there a deeper meaning? For example, yoga is not just stretching. Take note of what is erased when things go mainstream and take interest in learning more. Smarter in seconds.
All right. So one of Blair Amani, one of my favorite folks, talking and giving a general overview of what is appropriation versus appreciation. So to give a little more context, so yes, please buy from Native stores, artists, and designers. Visit open to the public events and powwows, read and share Native authors, acknowledge the land if you actively support Natives in other contexts, meaning, be willing to give land back or
give financial support and or participate and support in other ways, because there's many other ways besides financial means that allow people to connect and or help. So please do not ever wear a headdress, dress up as an Indian, use the word Indian outside of a chosen title, wear war paint, claim Native heritage without research. So in particular, the headdress wearing is something that comes up pretty frequently, unfortunately, especially, well, we just passed it, but Coachella season is often where we see, and also Halloween is when we see the most egregious uses of headdresses. In some cultures, only men wear headdresses. In some cultures, only women wear headdresses. Often they are a rite of passage and require a very clear and defined set of pieces of either cultural connection and or deed in order for you to obtain a headdress. And it doesn't always necessarily mean the same thing from tribe to tribe. War paint is often used again at sporting events as a way to frighten people. Wearing war paint is actually something that was derived from World War II. Many of the paratroopers without Native descent would wear war paint and dress up Native in order to scare Germans when dropping behind lines. And then many people claim Native heritage in order to get benefit, scholarships or access, especially to academia and other places. This is a current prevalent issue that's happening right now. Often they're referred to as pretendians. And it is a real issue. And so I will leave you with an image from my own powwow, from my own family, my own tribe's powwow, and just remind folks that we are still here. So I think this is a great time to jump into questions while I drink some water.
So if anybody wants to unmute and ask any questions, they can feel free to. If you would like to write your questions in the chat, I'm also happy to read those out loud.
You're not going to offend me if you want to ask me whatever you want to ask me.
I can also tell you, Sebastian, it might not be the first or last program we have where nobody has any questions. This has happened before.
I have given many a talk where no one has any questions, so it's totally fine with me. I just want people to know that I'm not going to be offended if there is something in particular that they want to ask, but don't feel comfortable asking.
So we had one comment that just said, thanks for a very informative talk. We'd love to learn more. I know that your sort of tribe that you grew up in is not local. I mean, are there people more locally in Boston that you were able to, have that sort of connection with? I guess was kind of my question, because I know people have to move for work, or, sometimes people meet somebody and they get married and then they move to different places. And I just want to say, like, has it been a struggle trying to find like connection? I would say, because Louisiana is not, it's not a quick drive away, right?
No, it's not a quick drive away. And it's interesting because, again, I did grow up in New York City and I moved to Boston because of my lovely wife, who we now have a son with. Her family is from Cape Cod. They live on Cape Cod still. And my Aunt Lois is here. Hi, Aunt Lois. Absolutely, many, especially cities and most states have multiple Indigenous organizations that support folks who are far away from their home or are connected with their home. Here in Boston, it's NICOB, which is the North American Indian Center of Boston. They're wonderful. They're actually listed here as the third one. They're a wonderful organization based in Jamaica Plain, and they service pretty much all of Massachusetts if you're willing to drive all the way there. They're working on hosting their first powwow. They have a wonderful space where they have a variety of different events, and they've been absolutely wonderful in working with folks, especially during the pandemic, delivering culturally sensitive and appropriate food, PPE, and a variety of other things. You can go to that link and support them if you are interested in it. And in fact, I think I can announce that the fee that was originally charged, or the fee that was discussed for my coming and talking, has been donated to NICOB as a way to give back to the community. And pretty much wherever I go and wherever I've been, there has always been a group or a series of folks who I could find and connect. We're everywhere. As I like to say, we are still very much here. In fact, a tribal member of mine got a job over in Western Massachusetts, and I've been able to see him a number of times and connect with him, which has really been lovely. And Facebook and social media have been huge parts of Natives organizing, connecting, and becoming stronger. As I said, I'm the webmaster, which is an outdated term, but I run the website for my tribe, and I also help run a Facebook group that allows people to communicate and connect with each other regardless of where they are.
We do have a question, Sebastian, very exciting. But somebody from the audience asked, how does your tribe view marriage outside the tribe?
Yeah, so my wife, do you want to come on camera? No, my wife doesn't want to come on camera. My wife is white. It would be impossible for everybody to marry within the tribe for a lot of different reasons. It's a complex subject, especially because of what's known as blood quotum. Blood quotum is a policy that was pushed very hard and continues to get pushed by the federal government. And the idea being that after a certain subset of marriages, or, if you don't have enough native blood, then you don't count as a tribal member. Of course, many tribes decide who is a tribal member and who is not a tribal member, but many of the qualifications in a lot of federally recognized tribes, not all, are based on blood quotum. My own tribe, being state recognized, technically has a blood quotum written into its constitution, which has changed, and now the tribe is looking to change it to simply direct lineage, given the fact that blood quotum is a tool for genocide. So essentially, if people continue to marry outside of their tribe or their culture, essentially and they continue to marry out, their children continue to marry outside of their tribe or culture. Essentially, one day, officially, according to the blood quotum rules, there will be no more Native Americans someday. And this is by design because the federal government doesn't want to pay up. My own tribe is completely open. Like there's no social stigma in marrying whoever you love who you love, and that's a wonderful thing. And I picked a wonderful partner who is very supportive and is very much finds it extremely important that we raise our son in a way that is connective with the tribe that we live in. And I could not envision marrying anybody else. On a separate note, like, although I have a huge connection with my tribe and the history and all of those things, I grew up in a very different place, in a very different, area, as Ryan kind of pointed out. New York City and a small town in Louisiana are very different places and have, in some ways, different political perspectives and things like that. So, everybody's going to be different. Everybody's going to have their own perspectives. So, you marry who you want to marry and figure it out from there. Hopefully that answered your question, Betsy. Yeah, so I'm just seeing the question now. So just to read it to everybody, do you know that our local high school just changed the name of its mascot? It was the Tomahawks for decades, and the change was controversial. Yeah, so there is, this is happening in communities across what is now known as the United States. There are thousands of high schools that are currently facing this, and not just necessarily because of Native mascots. There are other racist, sexist, and honestly also homophobic mascots that are being evaluated and changed. I understand why people like tradition. people like being set in their ways, and they say, hey, like when I was a kid, when my grandfather was a kid, when my grandmother was a kid, they went to the same high school, it was under the same name. It didn't make it not racist then. It just means that it's being brought to light now. So I think changes like that are very good, and that they're necessary, even if they are painful, and it requires some growth in the community. That's not to say that community, the whole community should definitely have input in what gets changed, what it gets changed to, and how it's, again, continually perceived by the community. And I did not know your community recently changed its mascot. Honestly, there's probably been about 8 or 9 that have happened in just the last year that I'm aware of in Massachusetts. So it's hard to track them all, to be honest with you.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Sebastian.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And hopefully that was, I know it was a very short, very brief, rough shot kind of overview. There was probably another 3 or 4 hours I could have kept talking, but I appreciate you having me and taking the time to learn a little bit.
Thanks, Sebastian. I'll get you talking another time.
Always on, Lois.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye now.